few weeks ago I did a video on a computer that I called the Scammer PC, and that's because a local guy here bought a computer on eBay, bought it from overseas, thought it was a gaming computer, and what he got was definitely not a gaming computer. But it came in this case here, and this case was probably the best part of it. But I did take the guts out of there, I did some upgrades to it, and I did make a PC out of that. You can check that video out on my channel. But I set this particular case aside because I wanted to put some other guts in it, some better guts in it, and make a better PC out of it. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery, and today we're going to be building a computer, in this case here, a gaming computer. But before we get into that, just a real quick note, this is a brand new setup for me as far as like cameras and stuff, so hopefully the cameras and the microphone's all coming through good. But let's get right into this. So like I said, we got a case here. It's not the highest quality case, but it's good enough, and it's going to be pretty. Got some RGB on there. It's a cheap case, but it looks good. And we're going to be putting some parts in it, so let's take a look at what we're going to be building. So starting off with a processor here, which it says i7 11700K, but it is, for some reason, a i7 10700K. And I'm not sure how I got that in there. I must have put it in the wrong box. But it's going to be a good little processor for what we're going to be building up. We got a nice little Thermaltake RGB fan to go along with that. Now, I tried to put this on a different build, but it was too big for the motherboard. It's a lot bigger than what the picture shows. I love these fans. They look good, they're cheap, and they do a decent job, but they do take up a lot of real estate on the board. So hopefully it'll fit on this board. We'll find out. If not, then I'll have to find some other solution. But I'm not going to be overclocking this thing, so a fan like that's going to be fine. We're going to slap in 16 gigs of RAM. So we've got some Crucial Ballistics DDR4, this 16 gigs RGB. So we got a little bit of RGB going on in this. Got some RGB in these fans also. So we'll make it look nice and pretty. As far as storage, we've got a 1 terabyte NVMe drive here. So this is a Crucial, and it's got a big old fat heatsink on it. So we'll slap that on the board. And speaking of the board, we've got this MSI here, and it's a MPG Z490M Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. So it'll fit nicely in this case here. We don't have room for full ATX, so a mini ATX will be great. And it's got built-in Wi-Fi, and that should be good to go. Now, as far as the GPU goes, I've got another device here that I tried to install before, this Intel Arc A750, and I did another video. I'll go ahead and link that up here somewhere, where I tried to build an all Intel build, and I was using, I think, a 9th gen or an 8th gen Intel, and it didn't have the right settings in it it wasn't optimized for this Arc A750, so you have to have at least a 10th gen. So we've got a 10th gen now. We're going to slap this in here, and I'm really excited to see how well it works. When we installed it before, it worked, but it just wasn't very fast. So I'm looking forward to seeing how well this thing performs. So that's all the bits and pieces. I think the next step is, let's go ahead and grab this motherboard here, and we'll start getting it all benched up with the RAM and the CPU. So I always like to take the board out and get it fully populated with the CPU, the cooler, the RAM, the SSD in this case, and get it all up and running. Hook a power supply up to it, boot it up, get it to post, install Windows, get all that done first, and then we slap it into the case. So let's go ahead and open this guy up. So here she is, and I love how it's got this integrated I/O shield here. That makes it nice and easy. So let's go ahead and get the processor ready. So like I said, we got this Intel i7 10700K, and let's go ahead and get this protective doodad off here, open that up. So when we get our CPU ready, don't want to touch any of the contacts. We're going to hold it by the sides, and if we look, there's going to be one corner that has a little notch on it or a little dot on it, and that's one we need to match up with wherever that is on the motherboard also. Now in this case also, we've got the little notches on the sides here, which will line up nicely with the little offsets here. So we're going to drop that in there gently, and I always give it a little wiggle with my fingers just to make sure it got all fully seated in there. And now when we lock this down and push the lever down, it's going to pop this protective cap off for us. So the CPU is done. Now before we put the cooler on here, I'm going to go ahead and put the RAM on, because sometimes with that big cooler, it's going to be sitting on top of where the RAM goes. So hopefully there's enough clearance to get the fan in here without hitting some of this other stuff. We'll find that out soon enough. And then I'll go ahead and mount the SSD in there, and then we'll figure out if the fan's going to work. So let's get this RAM ready. So as we look at our RAM, we're going to see that there is an offset notch on each of these, and that's going to match up with the offset notch in this row of RAM slots here. So let's go ahead and open up this second and fourth one. Looks like they're open already. And we're just going to make sure that we got the notch on the right side. We're going to go ahead and drop the RAM right in the slot. And I go ahead and just let it kind of slip in there by itself, get completely leveled out, and then I'm going to push down on one side and then push down on the other side right in succession. So click, click. So just push, push. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with the second stick. Get it lined up in the slot, let it sit down by itself, and then click, click. And that's it. If you're not sure which of the slots it goes in, you can always check with the motherboard booklet, and it should tell you which banks they need to go in. Alright, next up we're going to install the NVMe drive. And in this case, I'm not going to go underneath the shield here, since it's already got the heat sink on it. I'm going to go ahead and put it down in this slot. So in this case, we've already got a post right here, and we can find in the box somewhere a little bag like this. It's got tiny little screws in it. So we're going to go ahead and line this notch up here with the notch in the socket, kind of slip it down in at a slight angle, push it, make sure it's all the way in, and then we can make sure that this little half moon shape here is lined up with that stud. Then you want to grab one of those screws out of that little tiny bag, and I'm going to use my trusty Strabito toolkit here. It's got a PH0, a Phillips 0 head on it that's going to fit this screw perfectly, and it is magnetic, so it's going to hold on to it. So I can go ahead and get that threaded down into that socket without the fear of dropping it. Now our SSD is done. So let's see if this cooler is going to fit now. Alright, so before we get the protective little thing off here and get all the hardware out, we're just going to dry fit and set it down on top of that CPU and see if it looks like it's going to fit. And it looks like it will. So it's going to fit. Now you may have trouble getting this RAM out if we ever need to. May have to take this off first, but I think I'm okay with that. So let me get the rest of the hardware out and go ahead and get this thing mounted. Alright, so we got the bracket installed here, and before we put the fan on top we need some thermal paste. And this fan does come with some thermal paste in a little packet like this. I usually just take these and throw them to the side, save them for an emergency use, and then use something like this thermal take here. So let's go ahead and put a little bead of thermal compound right here in the middle. And I usually do just like a fat pea size. They say a pea size is good. I do a little bit fatter than that. And then we're ready to put this thing down. Now this has a little clamp. That's a little crazy. So I'm going to see if it fits on here around this SSD bracket here. And then I'll be back when that's done. Alright, so I got this fan on here. It wasn't easy, and I did have to rotate it around 180 degrees. Now the cables are coming out this side. And that's because the little latching mechanism here, which you can see right here, that was not going to get past this VRM heatsink. So it was bottoming out right here, and it just wouldn't get down there. So probably a better cooler for a much cheaper board that doesn't have really nice heat sinks on it. But I did get it down here on this side, and I did do a dry fit on the GPU to make sure that it was going to clear there. So now we got CPU, the cooler, the RAM, and the SSD. We are ready to fire this thing up. So let me go get a power supply, and I'm going to get just a cheap little graphics card to slap in here so that we have graphics, because that K variant does not have graphics built into it. And let's go ahead and get that hooked up so we can boot it up. Alright, so I grabbed the power supply, and I've got the power coming in both for the CPU and the main motherboard here, and hooked up a mouse and keyboard. Got a small little graphics card here since there's no graphics integrated into the CPU. Instead of putting the big GPU up here, I just grab a small one. This is what I always test with. Got my HDMI coming out of that going into a capture card. So, moment of truth, we're going to be booting this thing up. I've got this little test device here. Makes it nice and easy to just plug into the motherboard header here for the front panel header, and that way I can just push a button here. 9 times out of 10 I just grab a screwdriver and short out the right pins, but I try to be a good example when I'm doing a video and do it the right way. So once you hook this up, it is a lot easier. So let's go ahead and boot this thing up. And we got the fan spinning, we've got the RAM glowing. So far so good. We're looking to find some kind of a post, and here's our BIOS. So in here we can see we've got our Intel Core i7-10700K, 16 gigs of memory, so it sees that perfectly. We should be able to look to see if it finds the storage alright. Sometimes these things don't recognize and you got to play around with them, but we see right here M.2 1000 gigabytes. So that's my 1 terabyte Corsair SSD. So usually on the first boot or so, I don't worry about doing any kind of tuning in here with XMP profiles or anything. I just kind of keep everything stock and get Windows loaded, make sure everything works good, and then after everything's stable in Windows and all the drivers are loaded up, then I can come back in here and select whichever XMP profile I want to for the RAM. So this looks good. I think the next thing we need to do is grab a Windows install, and I'm just going to put Windows 10 on this for now. So I'm going to grab a Windows 10 install, and let's get that Windows on that SSD. Alright, so we got Windows all set up and all the drivers loaded, all the updates done, and as you can see in the little inset picture there, it's not quite running warm enough for that fan to kick on. I didn't mess with the fan curves in the BIOS, but that's one of the downsides of having a fan that drives the LEDs. This fan's just not going to have any RGB going on it if the fan's not blowing, so we may see that kick up here in a second once we start doing something with the computer. But I did go in and download the software for MSI to control the LEDs and the RGB, so I'll get that taken care of. So let's go ahead and take a look at our hardware just to make sure that everything looks right. And here's our CPU, and it's sitting very idle, of course, throttled way down, but that's the i7-10700K. Here's our 16 gigs of memory. Here's our 1 terabyte hard drive. And here's our NVIDIA GeForce GT 710, which we're just using as a placeholder. So everything's working great. All the drivers showed up perfectly, and I think it's time to take this thing all apart now and get all the parts put into the case. Alright, so I got the board mounted, of course the power supply mounted, got everything wired in, and I'll tell you, had to hold my tongue just in the right place to get some of these down here. These are really close to this bottom shelf here, but I got them in there. There's plenty of room up top here. So typically this one is the harder one. The power supply lead to the CPU is pretty tight, but there's a lot of room, almost as if there's enough room in this thing for a radiator up top here. We don't need to worry about that, but so plenty of room up top, really tight down at the bottom, and got everything wired up. So now it's just a matter of hitting the power button here and testing it up just to see that everything comes on. And I still just have this placeholder of a GPU in there. I just want to see everything turn on, see that I've got everything wired right for the RGB fans up front, and I've got, of course, the leads ready for the big GPU. So let's go ahead and hit this button. There we go. What a light show. So we got all 3 fans up front. We got a fan in the back. Those are all tied together with RGB. They are tied into the motherboard. I don't know if Windows has to get all the way set, and maybe I'll have to change the settings in that software again to account for that second RGB header, because there is 2 RGB headers. One at the bottom here that I've got these things set into, and then one at the top that I plugged the fan into. So it looks good. Windows is up. I'm going to go ahead and power this thing down, get out that big Intel Arc A750 GPU, and let's get that thing tested out. Alright, so we got the GPU installed in there, and it fits nicely. And it is a really beautiful GPU. I wish you could see the fans a little bit better in this setup, but you can't. But the top is really nice. We got it all wired in, so let's go ahead and boot this thing up, and we'll probably have to get some drivers and Windows. And there we go. So the camera looks like it's washing out this, but it does say Intel Arc right there, so that looks pretty nice. And Windows is up, but like I said, we'll probably have to get a driver, so let me grab one of those and I'll be right back. Alright, I got the drivers all installed, and I did have to go into the BIOS and enable the resizable bar. That's the option that you need to have in your BIOS before this Intel Arc will work really well. So I got that done. After that, it was running real smooth in Windows, so downloaded a benchmark, and I'm running a little time spy. So I'm going to let this go ahead and run, and I'll be back when it's done. Alright, so here are the results. And at first I was a little scared because I was getting like 60 to 70 frames per second, and you can see that here, but I accidentally ran it in 4K mode, so that's my mistake. I did look up this graphics score up here to see what it compared to, and it compares closest to an NVIDIA RTX 3060 Ti. So it's just a little bit better than the 3060 Ti, and not quite up to the 4070. So I'm going to say that's a pretty good result, considering you can find these things for fairly cheap on Marketplace right now, because everybody just loves those NVIDIA cards. So it's a pretty good bang for the buck. So the benchmark done. It's time to button up the hardware, and I'll give you a final reveal. And here she is. So it looks pretty nice. It's kind of like a fake Meshify case, but it's got lots of RGB. It's got a great processor, great GPU, fast SSD, 16 gigs of RAM. I think it's ready to rock and roll. So this case does have a nice hinged glass door, but I left it off because there'd just be way too much reflection on here. But it just magnets close, and we'll probably have to do a little bit of strain relief on this right here because it's got a pretty wicked bend. So I may just tack these down to the side there, but I don't think that's going to be too much of a problem. But I'm pretty happy with it. I've been wanting to use this Arc A750 and finally got a chance to. Got it all set up correctly, and it's running great. Now I just threw this together with some parts that I had laying around here, and I've got plenty more parts. So stay tuned to the channel because I'm going to be building lots more coming up soon. But I think that's going to do it for this build. If you liked it, I appreciate it if you go ahead and give me a thumbs up. If you want to see more, go ahead and hit subscribe. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought about this build. And I thank you as always for watching. And until next time, peace out and geek out.